Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Breda Haugh. I am a jeweller and design graduate from here NCAD, after which I graduated and completed further jewellery studies in Sir John Cass College in London, and after which I was employed in the jewellery industry. I'm just beginning showing a brief selection of some of my work. The first couple of slides is work which are contemporary selections which are sold to retail outlets, which include these ones. This is an exhibition piece which was last year for an exhibition I was in. And these are some of the pieces which I have been commissioned by the National Museum, and I produce these pieces based on some artefacts for their retail outlets. So that's a selection on that page, and this is a further selection. I also, these are based on some folk life artefacts, and they're in Thurlow Park, with a little bit in Dublin, but mostly in Thurlow Park. Remarkable metalwork, gold and bronze of great design and style, was made in Ireland and across Europe. Between and across Europe in the Bronze and Iron Ages, also in the Christian era, particularly up to the 13th century, and in the Christian era, particularly up to the 13th century approximately. However, events occurred in Ireland which disturbed the evolvement of this great visual language and craft skills tradition. As a student in London, I also noticed the attention given to artefacts from other cultures. For instance, there was a wonderful exhibition in the Royal Academy from South American gold in 1979 called The Gold of El Dorado. It was just, just to see that attention when ours it was at that time very much in the museum, in a corner in the museum. My first slide just illustrates the next point I'm making. This isn't the slide of the piece I'm going to just mention briefly, but it does illustrate part of the point. Recently I came across a silver tea service by Edmund Johnson, made in Dublin in 1870, for which a visual doesn't exist, referencing details from the art at chalice, which as a maker I felt seemed to show little respect to the artefact. This in particular inspired the theme for this presentation. I also wonder why our culture is so often represented by poor design and craftsmanship. This piece is actually by, I have the wrong name up there, I'm sorry, I just noticed. It's by John Smith of West's in Dublin, and it relates very similarly to the point I've just made. There are three elements to this presentation. I will examine, from a design and skill perspective, some artefacts and discuss the pathway design in metals has taken in our culture and how a strong aesthetic could evolve from such a stunning heritage. The archaeologist Mary Cahill from the National Museum will outline details of gold work from the Bronze Age 2000 BC to 600 BC, comparing early and late Bronze Age neck ornaments, lunula and gorgets, and the inspiration for the design, and will include a new interpretation of the derivation of gorgets and their relationship to European forms of bronze body armour. Finally, the historian Nicola Bowe will provide the historical background to the re-emergence of an indigenous aesthetic in Ireland and why, and will ask the question, does the need to be technically skilled, handmade but not industrially produced in the craft market mediate against the originality of concept expected and encouraged in the fine art arena? My first slide is of a lunula, and which, as you can see, 2000 BC, Bronze Age. The slide shows the delicate gold concentric neck ornament of great simplicity and refinement, which was probably forged from an ingot of gold, with an integrated fastening and incised linear decoration. Similar fashions are to be found in many cultures, but including also on the Neolithic curbstone sculpture at Newgrange. The amount of decoration varied, and some mistakes are to be absorbed seen on a few examples in the National Museum, showing the humanity of the creators. My next slide is showing the gorget, the ribbon gold gorget, which was ribbon gold torque, which was found near Belfast. Many torques were produced. This necklet with a strong design concept is light, strong, with great flow to the form, fully illustrating the dictum that form follows function. The timeless classic quality of the design inspires our admiration, creating a connection with its maker, and wouldn't look out of place today. There is sheer joy in its flamboyance. The silversmith Brian Clark with the American jeweller Michael Good have investigated the technical processes involved. And here I will show 4 slides just to illustrate that. Brian is twisting a strip of metal and double twisting it. Now, I'm not fully conversant with this technique, but it is on his website. And he's using antlers, the deer's antlers, because both of them felt that there had to be some piece of equipment from the era in which they were made, which was probably employed to create the technical, to do the technical processes. So this is what they've done, and this is his photograph, and that's where they're sort of forming the piece, and this is prior to forming it round into a necklet. The next piece I'm showing is the broader collar, which is a magnificent piece from the Latin period, circa 100 BC. This fine gold hollow hinged neck piece with a very complex fastening is technically brilliant, exhibiting stunning repoussé, and it was found and hatched engraved decoration, as you can see, and some granulation near the fastening. It is of the flamboyant Latin style, light and shade, a very energetic design. Latin, the style, was imported from Europe. And the next slide shows a diagram of the sort of pattern of the raised floral-like arrangement which is on it, and there's just a shield there. It's just to sort of show another example of it, but I was particularly illustrating on the magnificent work in that piece. The Christian era brought many fine pieces, and having a Viking, Saxon and Byzantine design and skill influence. The most important probably is the Ardat chalice. It's a religious artefact, one of the finest both for technique and design, and it was made in a monastic workshop. The arrangement of various elements, cup, handles, interlaced decoration, stem, linear detail, and most particularly the use of empty space is very pleasing. Many skills being employed in its execution: raising, engraving, filigree, gem setting and glasswork. These are two details now showing the enamel detail, some granulation, setting and the filigree work, and also the delicate incised linear decoration with the dot detail. And this is the side just under the handle, again showing the detail and also the very kind of fine arrangement of the elements. This is a Byzantine chalice, just to show a possible influence. This is a definite design influence, the Sutton Hoe belt buckle from circa the same era in the UK. It's very clear that there's a sort of a relationship design-wise. There was obviously communication and travel, etc. But these are very, very fine pieces also, and very high quality. Just to note that the Ardat chalice, along with the Tara brooch, were among pieces which were to be very influential in the re-emergence of a Celtic design movement in the 19th and early 20th century. These works, produced over thousands of years, exhibiting complex technical skills, superb understanding of design, must have been created for a sophisticated, wealthy society, both secular and religious, for which a strong cultural life was clearly important. What is also clear is that an organised, well-developed system of workshop practice and structure existed, as such consistency in quality of design and craft skills could not have been achieved otherwise. It is understood also that there was a system of travelling journeymen, craftsmen, going from town to town for work. After some time there was political disruption and a gradual change. Attempts were made to control the native population. For instance, it became illegal to dress in the old Irish way, and later laws were enacted to further control the lives of the people. This resulted in a number of things, but one thing was the interruption of the expression of the distinctive, confident visual language which had evolved over millennia. I'm now showing you while there was some very good work though also from this sort of transitory time, and the St Patrick's Bell Shrine is an example of it, and this isn't a particularly good image, but there is wonderful, it's a bronze box, to contain St Patrick's Bell. It was well made at a time when the changes in design influence were occurring. It has applied silver and silver gilt openwork decoration, including zoomorphic interlace in panels of beautiful, graceful design, which it must have been an inspirational for the Art Nouveau and arts and crafts people in due course. It is similar in kind of quality to the Cross of Cong. As can be seen, work continued to be made with the inspiration coming both from the Celtic past and Europe, which resulted sometimes in certain confusion and work which was not always as confident. For instance, in these two items, the Stowe missal cover and the Shrine of the Catholic from Ballygrotry, both of them would have had additional details imposed on them in later times from their initial start. It's just that they're beautiful pieces, but they just don't have, for me, quite the same clarity of presence as the earlier pieces in terms of, I suppose, decisiveness. Now, we're moving into the more modern era, and then gradual changes in the population and the resulting work. Work by the Huguenots and local silversmiths in Dublin in the 17th and 18th century was renowned and is highly valued. The designs, however, and beautifully made, the designs, however, were derived from those of continental Europe and England to appeal to the ascendancy and upper middle class customer. Here we have two sauce boats in the French Baroque style by Robert Calderwood, a Dublin silversmith. This is another artefact by Francis Jones, a Dublin silversmith. It's a dish ring with possibly design-wise influence to a degree, as it is portraying rural scenes in raised decoration. These were made to be put on the Georgian dining table, and so as not to damage the French polishing. The hot dish from the oven would have been put on top. The next item shows some freedom boxes, which are also artefacts from the same era. A conventional approach to the genre. However, these are beautiful pieces with engraved decoration and crests. However, there was a piece I have noticed in the museum, which I don't have a slide for, from 1790, which was the first piece I saw, time-wise, with applied interlaced decoration showing a castle, and just curious for that. Now, I'm moving on just briefly to vernacular craft. Oh yeah, okay, I'll do the first one first. This slide shows from 1820 a silver pigeen butter dish in Irish wood. Butter dishes in this format in wood were regularly used in rural Ireland, and it was the inspiration for this silver reproduction, and may reflect a looking inwards rather than to England for national identity. The owner of this piece probably saw the item reflecting their sense of identity with authentic rural Ireland, but it was made in silver, possibly to be more acceptable and have added value. It is a commoditised, stylised design rather than that of an original concept. Just to run backwards quickly. Oh, sorry, it seemed to be playing around a little bit. Vernacular crafts, just to mention briefly, as I had some samples of work earlier, which are based on some of them, but also just to make a point around it. A limited group, usually urban dwellers, had the opportunity to serve apprenticeships and develop high-end craft skills. However, vernacular crafts were carried on in rural Ireland, utilising suitable materials for functional and leisure use, including items related to folklore, such as harvest knots and Bridget's crosses. Harvest knots being exchanged at festival time, and Bridget's crosses being part of folklore and used for house protection. While I have no visual for this, but it is important to mention the blacksmith, who played a huge part in the rural community. The blacksmith made utensils in metal for the home and land, including cooking forks and gridirons. These items had an additional social purpose, as heart and initial motifs were regularly included, making them examples of integrated design as the process and purpose dictated the form. Initials and heart motifs were included as bridal gifts, or for gifts within a family. These individualised objects were imbued with meaning and sentiment, and for me I think they may relate to the attraction of personalised and souvenir jewellery. Now, moving forward to the 19th century. I include the Tara brooch because of its influence in the re-emergence for design in the 19th and early 20th century, and also because it was found in 1850. Archaeological findings in the 18th and 19th centuries were very exciting for finder and archaeologist. Along with the uniqueness of the finds, the ongoing re-emergence of a national identity created wide interest. Those concerned desired to reflect this in products they used, including furniture, clothing, precious metal and bog oak jewellery. The wearing of bog oak jewellery achieved high fashion status by the mid-century, employing Celtic iconography, and probably relates to the use of Whitby jet in England. I'm sorry I don't have a slide of it, but it just is quite a quirky item. I also don't have a slide for this following, but both are very visible in Collins Barracks Museum. Established jewellers such as Waterhouse produce test pieces, which are in the National Museum, directly based on the archaeological findings, particularly the Tara brooch and aspects of the Ardagh chalice. Interlaced decoration was becoming a recognised emblem of the country. Although there was strong encouragement to utilise emblems such as shamrocks, harps and castles in products representative of Irish culture, high-end designs were based with varied degree of success on archaeological findings. This next slide, this is a Celtic Revival brooch, and it was made by Hopkins and Hopkins in 1906, I think it is. It's based on part of the Ardagh chalice, and it's sort of not taking design to the journey, it might, but it is, of course, very much commoditised and to appeal to a customer base interested in national identity. I now return to the Smith coffee table service, which was made in Dublin by John Smith and is in the National Museum. It is decorated in an overall interlaced pattern enclosing a crest. A fascination with the intricacy and decorative aspects of interlaced decoration is understandable. However, again, as I mentioned previously, as a maker and looking at the service from that perspective, it appears Smith commoditised the work without great interest in evolving the motifs in any way, to the detriment of making an authentic design statement. And I'm following on just to show an alternative approaches. Both Ashby and Knox utilised sort of interlaced decoration in various ways on several items in a much more, they sort of took it as a base for design and developed it. These two slides don't particularly show that particularly well, but they illustrate a point, you know, the flow to the form, for instance, in that is very stylised, and it's yet in keeping with sort of the more international Art Nouveau movement, and also again the use of empty space and sort of just interesting arrangement of the shapes. I'm now coming into the start of the 20th century. To Mia Cranwell, her brooch is called, she was considered to be a jeweller working in the late Irish arts and crafts movement, but she was very active jeweller for all of her working life here in Dublin. In the early 20th century, Maria Cranwell was a jeweller based in Dublin, creating well-regarded works, inspired by archaeological finds and symbolism, often in a modern way with a personal vision. In this brooch, called the Rising Sun, and quoting from the arts and crafts movement in Dublin and Edinburgh by Nicky Gordon-Bowe and Elizabeth Gunning, the sun represented the destroying and purifying forces of fire and creative power. For me, I think this is quite significant in the thought process that went into it. As in, for instance, but not on the same level, Jack Yeats's paintings, the brother of William Butler Yeats, the poet. Mia Cranwell brought an element of the prevailing atmosphere to her work, hence its timeless quality. It's set with a cornelian. And I'm following that on with a slide to show current souvenir jewellery. This is an example of what follows on when sort of lesser skilled people or interested people really lifted designs wholesale without thought from the Book of Kells and many other artefacts or illustrations or just various different sources. In fact, I know book illustrations or designs based on various artefacts were used as a source rather than looking to the actual items which were the original source of the drawings. I just think it's not always the most positive reflection of a heritage, which I've just tried to illustrate is very, very stunning. There's Cartier in France, there's just such high-end, beautiful quality brands, not brands, but just quality work to be seen in some other cultures that I think it doesn't illustrate very well. But these pieces are not. There is far better there than representing our culture than these. But just this is a generic kind of thing that goes out as souvenir, which is sentimental and which is seen to represent us. In contrast, and an example of what can be achieved, I would just like to look at the work of two designers today currently working who sometimes use historical references. The first one is Vivienne Westwood, designer in the UK, Harris Cafe Society, Harris Tweed, and this is called, it's called 5 Centuries. The text has gone up on the photograph, apologies. Her work, to my mind anyway, shows wit and appreciation for heritage as an enduring aspect of culture. Her designs are made in wonderful fabrics and are savvy enough to appeal to a current customer base. My last slide, is Philip Stark. It's the Louis XV Ghost Armchair for Cartel 2002. The Baroque style is revisited to dazzle and captivate, appealing to our aspirational nature. Stark reads the atmosphere and we respond with emotion. In conclusion, I believe we can beneficially look to the achievements of the far distant past to carry forward the clarity of thinking and confidence in creation of work found there, to evolve our visual design language more fully, as has happened in literature and music, which have evolved so successfully as representative and mirrors of our culture. There are, of course, many solutions to this. So thank you very much.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and first can I just say thank you to Breda and to the organisers of the conference for inviting me to participate this afternoon. I'm going to concentrate on one particular aspect of Bronze Age goldworking from Ireland, and that is sheet gold work. I'm going to talk about two particular types of artefacts which come at both almost the very beginning of goldworking in Ireland and at the end of the Bronze Age as well. Breda has mentioned one of these object types already, and I'll be looking at that in a little bit more detail. Goldworking and metalworking in general begins in Ireland sometime after about 2,500 BC. We don't know exactly what the processes were, but we do know that we have the earliest copper mines in Western Europe at Ross Island in Killarney in County Kerry. It seems that the same people who perhaps came to Ireland looking for metal sources also certainly brought the knowledge of metalworking with them, using copper initially, then developing the copper tin alloy, making bronze, and also working in gold. And they may have been searching both for gold and copper at this time. The earliest gold work that we can date, well, dating is a big problem, but we can suggest that the earliest goldwork dates to the period from about 2300 BC or so, and the earliest expression is in the form of relatively simple objects made of sheet gold, taking for the most part circular form, such as these discs. Now, these are usually found in pairs. I think myself that where just one has been found, that the other one has been missed, because most of these finds were made and not recorded very well in the 19th century. They have been referred to as sun discs in the belief that they relate in some way to a cult of the sun. And this may very well be the case, but in terms of Ireland, we definitely lack evidence for this, in the sense that we cannot directly relate the objects to a cult of the sun. In fact, it's very difficult to relate them to anything because they're not found in burials, which is not very helpful, I must say. It would be far easier to interpret them if we knew who the people who would have worn them were. However, we do know that that there is a long tradition of astronomical observation going right back to the Neolithic period, probably earlier, and a great interest in cosmology and cosmological forces. So the idea that these may relate to a cult of the sun perhaps is not that outrageous. The most common type of artefact found at this period is the sheet gold collar that takes a crescentic form and is known as a lunula. And again, there's an idea that this relates to a cult of the moon. Once again, we lack that evidence directly, but from from monuments such as stone circles and stone alignments, we do know that these people had an acute awareness of astronomical movements, the movement of the sun, the moon, and the stars, and there's no reason why these aspects of their lives mightn't have been represented in some way in the artefacts that they were producing as well. Now, lunulae, as I say, are sheet gold collars. We don't have any real evidence that they're collars, other than that seems to be the way that they will work best. Antiquarians in the 19th century thought they were head ornaments of some kind, but they don't really work very well like that. For one thing, it's very hard to keep one of these things in place on the top of your head. They do seem to work much better as neck ornaments. The vast majority of them have been found in Ireland, although some are known from Britain and from the near parts of the continental Europe as well. They are divided typologically into 3 different types, and I'm just going to show you some illustrations of the most developed type, which is called the classical type lunula. And here you see in the slide one from Rossmore Park in County Monaghan. They are exceptionally skillful in the way the sheet is worked. These classical ones are the thinnest and the widest, and while they are very thin at the centre, they are deliberately thickened at the edges to give them some strength. A feature is of the decoration of them, which is very simple geometric forms, a quite small repertoire of designs, but always producing different patterns from one lunula to another. A feature of these better ones is that there is a very accurate symmetry from one side of the object to the other. The decoration is confined to the terminals, to the narrower parts of the collar, and to the inner and outer edges, as you can see there on the slide. Here is another example, one of 3 found at Bonmore in County Kerry in the 19th century. And you can see on the detail there this light incision, which is the principal method of decoration, although you will find on some of them that some elements of repoussé may also be introduced, but that's rare enough. Here is another one from Killarney in County Kerry, another classical type lunula, where the decoration, you can see here how accurately it matches from one side to the other. Now, our sort of model of a princely chieftain that you see there in the middle, if he looks a little 80s, that's because he is a little 1980s. This was used as a sort of main motif for a poster for a very important exhibition that was held in Edinburgh at the National Museum of Scotland, called Symbols of Power. And it seemed rather, I suppose, risque at the time to have a bare-chested man wearing a gold collar on a museum exhibition poster. And he has been kind of used and abused ever since that. As I say, we lack burial evidence, so we can't say for definite whether they were worn by men or by women, or perhaps both. Personally, I think myself that it's the more likely case is that they were objects of male adornment rather than female, which relates to particular types of burials and other information that we have, not from Ireland but from graves of the same period that occur in Britain, where gold ornaments are sometimes occasionally found, and these tend to be males of high rank. This is a very, very special one from Mangerton in County Kerry. Now, the only reason why Kerry crops up is because I just happen to have best illustrations that I have are of objects from Kerry. There is quite a scatter of these throughout the country. This one is actually in the British Museum, not in the National Museum, and I have to say that perhaps the 2 best lunulae known from Ireland, one from Blessington in County Wicklow and this one from Mangerton, are both in the British Museum, but that's for historical reasons to do with the activities of collectors in the 19th century. But I think the detail here gives you a good idea of the skill level involved. It seems that well, we know that Irish lunulae were known outside of Ireland as well, particularly in Britain, and copies in jet and in amber were produced there. There are quite a few Scottish jet necklaces known, some of them coming from early Bronze Age graves as well, and in southern England in particular, in the Wessex area, which is very important at this period, a lot of decorative amber work is found, and you can see the reconstruction of a crescentic collar there in amber, which seems to be emulating the whole idea of the Irish gold lunula. So that's sheet gold work in the early Bronze Age, and I'm going to skip now to a period much later. I perhaps should say that we don't really know when this phase of production in the early Bronze Age finished, because dating evidence for this period and for the gold in particular is so difficult. However, although sheet gold working didn't die out completely, they did turn to other forms of gold work using cast and hammered bars of various types to make torques, to make bracelets, to make dress fasteners. But there is a huge resurgence in sheet gold work in the late Bronze Age, in the latest phase of the late Bronze Age, which is known as the Dowers phase to those of us involved in archaeology. And again, we're dating in the period, we think, somewhere between about 900 to about 600 BC. This particular type of gold work is very, very confined in its distribution, with most of these large gold collars called gorgets, and this is what I'll be talking about now in the second part of the talk. Their find places are confined to the lower Shannon basin, to counties Clare, Limerick and Tipperary. That is not to say that this type of gold work isn't found in other parts of Ireland. It is, and in particular, a very important find, which I'll come back to later, was made in County Wexford in 1990, and this has allowed, it brought some entirely new artefact types to our knowledge, and also a question of how these objects are going to be, should be interpreted in terms of their form and their function. Now, a gorget is a much more complex piece of gold working than a lunula, which is just a single piece of sheet hammered up from an ingot. In order to assemble a gorget, you need a minimum of 5 pieces, more like 7 and possibly up to 9. I've taken the example here of one from Gertine Ray in County Clare, found with some other objects under a stone in about 1946, I think. We're looking at the back of the lunula, of the gorget here, and these big raised ribs have been developed on the surface of the sheet. What happens then is that the outer edges are turned outwards over a wire to give some strength to the edges, perhaps. And then the ends of the collar are decorated with terminal discs, which in themselves are made up of 2 pieces: a lower disc, such as you see here, unusually not decorated, they usually are decorated. This is the upper disc. One is placed on top of the other, but not before the lower piece is attached here, usually by gold stitching. Now, there is one example where gold rivets are used, but that's an exception. They're usually stitched together with gold wire. The highly decorated outer disc then, or upper disc, is placed on top. The edge of the lower one is just folded over it. And sometimes you may find there's an addition of a piece of a gold strip, a kind of a moulding, just to finish off the whole thing. Here is the front of the Gertine Ray collar, and another example from North Tipperary, from Mark Coney on the other side. You can see here how the number of raised ribs varies from one to another. This is the lowest number, you will find 3, and I think the highest number is 11. Now, usually between the raised ribs there are areas of very fine decoration produced by chasing and by repousse. Here are some details of the Arcroni collar, showing here the twisted wire gold stitches which attach the collar to the disc to the collar, here with the disc attached. Here you see the back of the lower disc, and the decoration, although still concentric, is quite different and much simpler. And very often in the area under here, which you can't actually see, it remains unfinished. So they were a little bit, maybe not lazy, but economical with their time perhaps. If it wasn't going to be seen, then the surface didn't need to be decorated perhaps. And here in the detail here, you can see the incredibly fine cable patterning or rope moulding, as it's sometimes referred to, that occurs between the discs. Now, various scholars and people who have devoted a lot of time to thinking about how these metal work types come about have considered the whole question of the development of gorgets. And Dr. Joseph Raftery, who was a former keeper of Irish antiquities in the National Museum, thought that they had been some kind of an amalgamation of this type of heavy sheet gold collar and the earlier torques, the twisted flanged bar torques, and that this is what gave you this idea of raised ribs with the rope moulding pattern in between the ribs. Others believed that ultimately we would find the background in Scandinavia and northern Germany with these bronze collars, and yet later another man called T.G. Pohl suggested that this collar, which is from Sintra in Portugal, which has these little buds, if you like, as terminals, that might prove to be the background for this particular type of goldwork from Ireland, which, as I said, is confined for the most part to the Lower Shannon Basin, and there is this whole element of the Atlantic fringe during the Bronze Age, what was happening not just in gold but also in bronze metalworking at this period as well. However, I have in the last while developed another theory or idea about how these gorgets came to be in the particular form that they are. And my idea or theory is that they are actually derived from a small number of finds of sheet bronze armour known from various parts of Europe. Now, this whole business of making sheet armour in bronze seems to have arisen in the East and gradually worked its way across Europe. And the most westerly finds are in eastern and northeastern France. The one that you see on the screen there is from a hoard of sheet bronze cuirasses found at a place called Félange in France. And I'm just going to point out some of the features of the sheet bronze cuirass to you. You can see here the attention that's paid to the breast area with these dots and the raised boss there representing the nipple. You can see these alternating bands of bosses, of little rows of dots, and this kind of patterning in between, which again gives the effect of cable or rope moulding. The way in which they're put together is also important. They are joined by a series of rivets down one side, and then on the other side there are slots and tabs which fit into one another. And the shoulders are attached in the same way. You have the tab and the slot here, as you can see. Here's just another view of that one from Félange. You can see the slots here on the side, and the way in which the rivets work. They've obviously come apart there. And these are all important details in terms of interpreting the derivation of the Irish gorgets. I perhaps should have said that the gorgets occur only in Ireland. There is no other sheet gold work of this type occurring either in Britain or in Western Europe at this period. Here's another example from a sort of a boggy, marshy place called the Petit Marais at Marmesse in France, this is one of a hoard of 9, which were found stacked one inside the other, which is interesting in itself, but I'll probably have to leave a discussion of that to another day. You can see again how the breast area is very well defined, these raised ribs reflecting exactly that, the ribs, and on the back you will see reference to the anatomical features, the spine here, the ribs again. Now these are not accurate in terms of their anatomical detail. They're not meant to be. They're meant to represent the anatomy. In this detail here, I think you'll see very clearly the way the rivets and the slot and the tab works in joining the various pieces together. So just to look at some detail then, here we see from the drawing earlier a detail of the breast area. This is the object itself, and here is the terminal of a gorget which is known to be from County Clare, although we don't actually know exactly where. And you can see just how closely similar these are to one another. You can see the way the ribs have been decorated here with these small little round bosses as well. Now this is the only gorget, this one from Clare, in which these the raised ribs have been decorated. This is also the very heaviest of all of them that survive, weighing somewhere in the region of, let's see now, see in the 19th century they're always in ounces, and 12 ounces, so that would be maybe the best part of 400 grams, something like that. It's exceptionally heavy. The rest of them are much lighter and would only weigh about half of that amount of gold. Here are some other examples where the terminal is more developed, but here's another example from a cuirass from France, I think as well, or perhaps this one is from Italy. And you can see again that there's a very close relationship there. This whole idea of concentric ornament working out from the central boss. I mentioned already in making the gorget that the outer edges of the collar are turned outwards over a wire, and this is something that is reflected also in the cuirass. The edges of the sheet bronze at the neck, the arms, and at the waist are all turned out over a wire as well. And again, we have in this one, which is from Tory Hill in County Limerick, which has the highest number of raised ribs, reflecting this idea of the ribs of the the body. And here again, if we look at the detail of the County Clare gorget, this dotting motif between the bosses, and here you see this again exactly the same on the cuirass. And you may wonder, why would somebody go to such lengths to make such an extraordinarily complex object as an Irish gorget, when really you could, if you just wanted a visual impression, you could actually produce something in a much simpler way. And what about the back of the cuirass? How could that possibly be reflected in the gorget? I think myself that it's the lower disc of the gorget which represents the back of the cuirass, and that the goldsmith has interpreted the back of the cuirass in this way. And the reason for that is because, as I mentioned already, the ornamentation on the lower disc is always much simpler, much smaller range of motifs, very much like you see here, which is reflected again on the back of this cuirass from Marmess. And here you see a very kind of almost, it's still concentric, but it's quite chaotic in that particular case. You do wonder, when you look at these objects in detail, whether apprentices got their hands in some bits and pieces. They weren't quite as well as skilled or mature in terms of their workmanship as some of the things that you see on the front of the objects. Now, this is at the front and the back of a very important gorget from Shannon Grove in County Limerick. This is on exhibition in the jewellery room of the Victorian Albert, if any of you should find your themselves in London. It is a truly magnificent object. It's also perhaps the most complicated in terms of its structure and construction of all the surviving Irish gorgets. I might just point out to you, just as an aside really, you see this line here. This is because most of them show evidence of having been folded slightly off-centre before they were deposited in the ground, and this seems to be effectively part of the act of decommissioning the object and inserting it in the ground from which it was not to be removed, at least not during the Bronze Age. I just want to show you some details of the Shannon Grove Gorget about the way in which it is constructed, because I think this bears very heavily on this whole interpretation of the gorgets being derived from the sheet bronze armour, from the breastplates. It's the only one that isn't stitched together. It's actually put together by gold rivets. And it's the only case that we know of where the discs were actually riveted to the collar. And what the goldsmith did as well was that he actually raised on the surface of the disc, the lower disc, the impression of tabs, such as would fit through the slots, as we saw on the breastplate itself. These we would refer to as skeuomorphs in archaeological description. This, I think, is extremely important, and I think it's a very kind of defining feature in judging how well this interpretation stands up. What I think probably happened then was one or other goldsmith in a conversation over a cup of tea or whatever said, you know, lads, there's an easier way of doing this. We could just stitch all this stuff together. Because although riveting is known from sheet bronze work at this period, this is the only occasion where it turns up in gold working. So I think they just decided that stitching the whole thing together would be easier in the long run. Nonetheless, the fact that this object has survived from Shannon Grove does really tell us a great deal about how all the different aspects of the cuirass are reflected in the making of the gorgets one way or another. Now, as I said already, the nearest to us, geographically speaking, in terms of discoveries of sheet bronze armour of this period is in eastern France. But so how could this idea have come to Ireland? What's important, time? Yeah. Right, okay, I'm nearly there. What's important to remember is that there are many contacts between Ireland and Europe at this period, and that ideas move in many very different ways. This is an example of Villanovan pottery helmets, which are skeuomorphs in themselves of bronze helmets used in Italy during this period. The idea of these gets as far as Denmark, and they are converted into ornaments that are worn by women. Here again, the same idea. These become, from Italian bronze shields, they become belt boxes in Denmark, and again worn by high-class women. And the same happens with gold hats. Now, I was going to very, very briefly say that this type of gold work is also reflected in another type of object. These used to be called gold boxes, but as a result of the discovery at Ballinesca in 1990, we now know that we have a whole other type of artefact very closely related in terms of its making and the way it's decorated. And these are the gold boxes and bobbins, which we have now interpret as ear spools. And we now know that there are three types of these extraordinary and extremely rare objects known only from Ireland at this period. They relate very, very closely to the gorgets as well, both in terms of the decoration, the way they're made, and also reflect elements of the sheet bronze cuirass as well. So I just wanted to mention that very briefly, and just to say how widespread this whole idea of wearing elaborate ear ornaments is, and then to finish with this slide showing you one interpretation of what a late Bronze Age Irish tribal chieftain might have looked like when he was sort of decked out, if you like, for some important ritual occasion. And finally then, just to finish with the description from a later period of Lulav Ada, which I think does reflect back something of the late Bronze Age gold work as well. Thank you very much, and sorry for running over.
I just want to sum up quickly, and then I'm going to show you really a lot of images to try, and funnily enough, to try and echo what's been said now. I wasn't quite sure what exactly was going to be said, but anyway, I hope it'll tie things together. And I think that Mary would like the idea, perhaps, if we might have some Q&A at the end. And so I hope I'm going to raise issues. And funnily enough, I am actually going to reflect various things that both, I hope, that both Breda and Mary have said. 19th century Ireland's acceleration of the quest for political independence was increasingly marked by the assertion of cultural identity. Spearheaded by scholarly antiquarian research and archaeological discoveries, national consciousness was fueled by a growing awareness of the visualization of past indigenous achievement in the latter half of the century. Prehistoric, Celtic and early Christian artefacts displayed publicly in exhibitions, pageants and ephemeral publications inspired a new generation of writers and designers alike. These discoveries were paraphrased and studied as model design exemplars of superlative technical skill and original thought. Images, as you've seen, of the Tara brooch, the Arda chalice, the Book of Kells and Cormac's Chapel in Cahill, for example, became appropriated by popular culture and became hallmarks of emerging nationalist aspiration. So, for example, you see here this image from Henry O'Neill's illustrations of the most interesting of the sculptured crosses of ancient Ireland, of 1853 to 9, you see people earthing literally against the high cross, that you don't have archaeologists gazing at it, but you actually have people from the land sitting, lying and relating very strongly to it, and the way these illustrations were framed was very important. One of the most interesting examples of the rediscovery of the past in design terms is this wonderful epic poem by Samuel Ferguson called Cromlech on Haugh, the Cromlech on Haugh, which contained evocative illustrations and very careful archaeological studies, and also studies of the illuminations from the books of Kells and Darrow by Margaret Stokes. But it also had a postscript on Celtic ornamental art by George Petrie, who is the father of scientific investigation into the archaeology of Ireland, and who was elected onto the Council of the Royal Irish Academy in 1839, where he set up a museum. This is the frontispiece by Margaret Stokes of 1861, the Cromlech on Haugh. So it is modern, but it's using a modern design approach to an ancient manuscript that no one had really studied and looked at in terms of dynamic design. And then at the back you have Petrie's exhortations to use simple paraphrases of this superb design which had been, he says that the Tara brooch, for example, which we'll look at later on, is superior to any hitherto found in the variety of its ornaments and in the exquisite delicacy and perfection of its execution. He was fascinated by how simple the design of the early Christian metalwork was, but also how apposite for today. The first time that Celtic decoration or Celtic ornament had been reproduced as a vocabulary of design for artists and ornamental designers was in 1856 with the Grammar of Ornament by Owen Jones, where there were 3 pages of Celtic ornament designed by and written about by Obadiah Westwood. And of course what's fascinating is that the design that you've seen here bears a very strong resemblance to Owen Jones's real passion, which was the Alhambra, and if you saw that on its own, would you not think, wouldn't you think that that was Celtic? And of course what was fascinating is that during the revival period, Arto Murnaghan, who was a theosophist, as so many people were at the time, and a stage designer, and also very involved with textile design as well, would evolve this sort of strange synthetic form of ornamental design, which emulated Celtic design, but also looked to Aztec and looked to all sorts of other design. And he formulated this in terms of, this is really the sort of flyer page of 1922, which led to the Lana Hashariga, the pages of the Book of Resurrection, which you can see in the National Museum. This was really, how can we emulate the people who've died in 1916 onwards, who fought for political freedom and independence in Ireland? Well, the best way was seen as doing this book, which took him 30 years to illustrate, and its pages are in the National Museum. So people looked at the Tara brooch, and like so many of this was discovered beside the beach in Bettystown in County Meath. You all know this story. By a woman who then took it to an ironworker in Drogheda, and it was bought by Waterhouse, and eventually, 18 years later, it went to the Royal Irish Academy's museum. But in 1851, it was already being reproduced. This is in 1888, an exhibition in London. Queen Victoria bought 2 copies at the 1851 Great Exhibition in the Crystal Palace. This is Waterhouse selling it heavily. Here is, well, you don't even know if that's the brooch or a paraphrase or a facsimile of it, and various other brooches which you could buy. And Waterhouse certainly made their money out of it. I was absolutely fascinated when I was in Tunisia a couple of years ago, when during a rather terrible circumcision ceremony, which I got caught in the middle of while I was studying Islamic decoration, these women, Berber women, came in, and of course, guess what they've got on their chests. So after a great deal of smiling and sort of saying, you know, I come from Ireland, I managed to do as close up as I could get. But here they are wearing torques on their breasts. So perhaps further to Mary's talk, maybe this is how women wore torques in ancient Ireland. And of course in revivalist Ireland, a Tara brooch, as it was usually known, how close it was to the brooch. I have to tell you that, of course, the Tara brooch, so called, was discovered at Bettystown in County Meath and then marketed as the Tara brooch, i.e. such as might have been worn by the High Kings of Ireland, you know, the Hill of Tara. And that, so it was a tremendous selling device. Mostly places where the artefacts were discovered, when the building railways, digging potatoes, whatever it was, then, but like the Ardagh chalice, it's wherever the hoard was discovered, that gave it the name. But here we have, in the revivalist period, Chester Trent, who was a young artist who died in the flu epidemic in 1918 when she was in her early 20s, wearing a revivalist costume made by the Dyneema Guild girls in a sort of William Morris enterprise, but she's wearing a brooch which symbolises her devotion to nationalism. And of course, these brooches could be copied. They were studied in great detail by Margaret Stokes, who one of the speakers mentioned yesterday. Margaret Stokes' book, her Early Christian Art in Ireland, was copied by all designers in Ireland. It became a textbook, and her wood engravings are superb. I mean, the illustrations, which were wood engraved, absolutely superb. And she appreciated enormously the metalwork and how beautifully it was done. This wasn't the case with Hopkins and Hopkins. Here's their Tara brooch. You can have a facsimile, you can have it in silver, you can have 9-carat gold, 15-carat gold, 18-carat gold, you can have miniature size, you can have big or little, etc., etc. You can have it in lots of different variations. So, and it became a mark of nationalism. The biggest ever display of Celtic artefacts, some of them reproductions, but some of them originals, were at the St. Louis Historic Loan Collection exhibition, where there were 4,000 years of Irish history represented, which spanned from the Bronze Age, from 1500 BC up to the 12th century AD, and they also had a lot 18th century, 19th century. So this discovery was they had a lot of jewellery, but this rediscovery of what ancient Ireland might have been was put into this strange sort of Disney world along the pike in St. Louis, and you have Gandon's House of Lords, you've got Cormac's Chapel, you've got Blarney Castle, you've got all sorts of buildings that were perceived as archetypically Irish. You've got the Abbey Theatre in one tiny corner, and you've got the Austrian Alps beside it, because the Austrian exhibit happened to be next door. And the awful thing is that actually quite a lot of original work was shown as well. So if the boat had gone down, heaven knows what would have happened. The Tara brooch, so-called Tara brooch, and you can see what a long way it is from the Tara brooch, was adopted by Maud Gonne and her women of the Ingolina Helen as a badge of nationalism. And of course they also, in the Kuman Navan, they also had a rather less subtle means of expressing their form of militant nationalism. And of course here in this play, which was performed by Patrick Pearse, the great Irish patriot who was killed in 1916, he wrote a play called Anri, which means the king, in 1912, a morality play set in a monastic school in medieval Ireland. Which was performed as a pageant in the garden. And you see the boys from the school are wearing fur. These rather strange sort of wings on their heads, which is supposed to show that they're vaguely Viking, or because the Vikings actually had invaded Ireland. So anyway, so a lot of cross metaphors. But they are wearing brooches to hold up their brats or their cloaks. The Ardagh chalice was plagiarized mercilessly. But what was fascinating is it was also looked at and studied. In 1869, Edmund Johnson, who has been mentioned before by Breda, was allowed to not only study it very carefully, but to unpick it. And he looked at it very carefully. He discovered there were 354 separate pieces of metal used to form the chalice, held by 20 rivets. And so he enormously respected it. But he was soon making paraphrases of it. This is a sugar bowl, which is rather strange to think that a chalice was used for administering the communion, and then, in no time it was a golf trophy, it was a sugar bowl, it could be a mustard pot, depending what size you had it. And then Hopkins and Hopkins took the pieces under the handle and made it into the Ardagh clasp, a clasp for coat, belt or cloak. So you could actually have the handles of the Ardagh chalice reenacted as a clasp, or you could have the Tara brooch recomposed as the Tara belt clasp. So there were endless variations. This is Johnson's Ardagh belt clasp of 1906. And then similarly, the shrine, which held the holiest of holy bell of St. Patrick, this beautiful shrine which was in the Royal Irish Academy and then was moved in 1891 to the National Museum, the newly built National Museum. Here it is photographed by the Keeper of Antiquities, and here it is paraphrased by Edmund Johnson, which is the most extraordinary, shows his skill. But what is so interesting about this is that this was paraphrased for Chicago. Between 1891 and 1892, Edmund Johnson made 182, basically he called them facsimiles, of Irish metalwork antiquities, which he sold to the Field Museum in Chicago, the Columbia Museum, for $10,000. And then he set them at various department stores, further to what Anna was saying in her talk, took further facsimiles. They were enormously popular, but they did show what incredible skill he had. He was able to make these. He could also descend to sugar bowls, but he understood the way things were made. And he said there is nobody who would ever, although that's a pretty good likeness, nobody could ever do what the early metalworkers had done. Here he is working with Professor William Scott, who was the first professor of architecture at the National University in Ireland in the early years of this century, making a paraphrase, he preferred to call it in 1916 here, of the Cross of Cong. And further to what Mary was saying, I mean, before the National Museum moved, the Royal Irish Academy held what was called a gold room. And the gold room was where people could go to study and be amazed and thrilled by seeing the actual objects that were appearing in Ireland. Elizabeth Crook has written that claiming the ownership of the past was necessary to create a sense of place and to symbolize power. Raising the status of the ancient past was a method of shortening the distance between the present and the ancient nation, in the hope that the time taken to recreate the independent nature of the future would also be lessened. And so by going and looking at these and emulating them, it was a bridge with the past. And then been looking at collars, but what is so interesting is that the sheer simplicity of these enormously appealed to art critics of the time. The most outspoken was T.W. Ralston, who was the secretary of the Irish Industries Association and who was the person who he organised the St. Louis Loan Collection, and he also ran the Irish Arts and Crafts Society for quite a long time. He said that what Ireland needs is the general intellectual cultivation of the country. I mean the element of national individuality, the things in which the human spirit shows real mastery. They are in the blood, they are traditional, they belong to a great continuous racial life reaching from far behind us and passing onward far beyond us. The great need of modern Ireland is to be reunited with its past. But, on the other hand, he asked people to look at the sheer simplicity of design like this. He thought the twist, I mean, can you believe how long ago these were made? These incredibly beautiful earrings, these twisted gold earrings. And he said, look at these, don't look at the awful incrustations. He said he said, look, he wanted objects that looked as though they were doing the work for which they were intended. Here are some methods which were reproduced by Hopkins and Hopkins. He deplored the lack of national appreciation for beauty and fitting design. He believed that the spirit of originality had been stifled by the slavish spirit of imitation of foreign ways and things which had prevailed for so long. He called for functional, beautiful, useful and necessary artefacts. He thought that items such as fire irons and fire dogs, clock cases, turf boxes, small tables, hall chests, lampstands, door knockers and door handles, not covered in carving, underlined, do not appear at art exhibitions in Ireland. He's writing this in 1904. That they do not appear. And though one could acquire any number of tankards that Cuchulainn might have drunk mead from, which are beyond the capacities of men in these degenerate days, he said the faintest breath of the new spirit in art has yet to reach craftspeople. Avoid mere prettiness, be rough if you must, but be strong. Above all things, be yourself. Make your own designs. Don't imitate. Don't conceal the qualities of your material. Study the arts of the past, above all those of your own land. But remember, you do not live in the time of Brown, but of Mr. Edison. Here is a christening mug made out of bog oak, but unfortunately it does have a lot of interlace, but it was one of the most popular ones that you could buy in a jeweller in the early years of this century. What Ralston liked was the pot on the ground, the cauldron on the ground. That is what he liked. He loved this castle, he loved that, which is the Castle de cauldron from the 7th century BC. He loved this, which is a Celtic bronze cremation bowl from Christ's time. And what's interesting is that he's anticipating the work of Sonia Landwehr, who we've already seen in Anna's talk. Here is a Bowe by Sonia. Sonia started off with KDW, the Kilkenny Design Workshops, working with glazes, with pottery, but she's now turned to using cast metals. And she's emulating the bronzes she made then. This is a piece she made a couple of years ago in this beautiful, simple, elemental, monumental style. And it's very interesting to see. But unfortunately, what most people wanted was the decoration, the Celtic imitation. But at least this is a restrained example in the Honan Chapel in 1916, made by Johnson to Scott's design. There were interesting designs being made. This is from Coleraine, made in 1901, using repoussé silver. Mary Houston making a casket which was restrained, but it was in the shape of an ancient casket, as this one is too. This is by Mere Cranmore, who Breda mentioned. This is the casket that was made to contain the first Irish Free State Senate roll, and it is now in the Royal Irish Academy, made by a great craftswoman who had been trained in Manchester with Frederick Newland Smith. And a very intelligent, symbolic, suppressed and strong use of Celtic ornament. And this is the brooch you've seen, which illustrates the rising sun. and it's the rising sun, the east wind and the stars. And she illustrated poems when she could. Other people, this is a piece commissioned by the director of the National Museum in 1902 from Alexander Fisher, who had revived Limoges enamels, and it shows the life of St. Patrick. So exhibition pieces were specially commissioned. This is by the painter Letitia Hamilton working here. This was an exhibition piece made at the School of Art in Dublin, and it shows the spirit of the earth giving strength. It's really Angus Oak, the eternal young god, giving spirit to a man who's toiling under what looks rather strange. It's full of flowers. I suppose you imagine he'd be tilling potatoes, but he's not anyway. It's supposed to be, it's called inspiration. This is a war memorial. There were a lot of war memorials, and enamelling came into its own with these war memorials. This is in Dublin, in Grange Gorman, and it shows an angel of death, but giving hope to the many young men, 40,000 who died in Ireland at that time. And if you went to the Celtic Revival Fair called the Éanna Tailteann, you could be awarded a silver, a gold, or a bronze medal with the head of Queen Tailteann, who was a devouring queen who said, well, if you want my hand, you have to run 5,000 miles, you have to ford 1,000 streams, you have to jump 1,000 hurdles, you have to sing 1,000 songs and dance, and then I might talk to you. You know, that sort of heroic queen who was invented. But you see, the other thing which is so interesting is that there, all work at that time was marked by the Irish trademark, which is on these boxes. And so you find the figurative occurring largely within the sort of peak of the Irish revival. And this is one of the most beautiful trophies. One of the things which I do think is rather ignored is, first of all, medals don't seem to recur very much now, but also trophies. I mean, when you think what's given for the... Well, I mean, I better not be discreet about this, but anyway, there are some terrible trophies around. And this is one which is still being used. It's the Dublin Horse Show Perpetual Challenge Trophy. It was designed by Percy Oswald Reeves, who taught metalwork in this college between 1903 and 1953. He was a man of tremendous skill. He went to the Royal College of Art, and then he trained with Alexander Fisher, and he was headhunted to come here. And this trophy was done in 1935, and it shows Ara, Hibernia, playing her harp, which doesn't have broken strings for a change, which is what she usually has, and a horse is just listening to her playing music. It's very beautiful, and unfortunately the owner isn't allowed to keep it, but it has to go straight into a vault. The embarrassing thing that happened in Ireland was that when a new currency was being sought in 1926, none of the Irish sculptors who submitted designs were chosen. And so this, which was the definitive Irish currency that was first used in 1928, after the founding of the Free State, was designed by Percy Metcalfe, a very able English designer. Medals continued to be fairly figurative. This is by Lawrence Campbell, designed during the Irish Emergency, which is during the Second World War in 1944. And you have a sort of slightly Hollywood-esque figure of Hibernia with her wolfhound, you know, it was slightly crudely done, but it was still not badly modelled. Again, Percy Oswald Reeves came to the fore with this tremendous trophy for the Gaelic Athletic Association. This was for the Golden Jubilee and the Mullingar Town Trophy that dates from 1943. And the last trophy that he designed was for the Irish Red Cross, which was in the 40s, which is particularly good, and it shows Cuchulainn dressing the wounds of the wounded soldiers at Clontarf in those little bas relief panels up at the top. So it's very fine work and not at all known. When I was in Limerick lecturing last week, of course I was reminded of the way that the Celtic interlace, whorls, triskells have been used in popular culture, and this is a manhole cover, and also, of course, the water covers. I mean, this idea of the whirling circle and triskel has been used really throughout the 20th century in Ireland until certainly the 70s. Very similar to the shields that you find in the book illustrations of the time, and I thought this was a Celtic interlace thing outside the IFI, the Irish Film Institute in Temple Bar, until somebody pointed out to me it was a film reel. I was getting really excited about that. I thought at last I found a really original piece of Celtic interlace. Anyway, the subtlety. But of course, if you go into Temple Bar, which any visitors probably will go, they will see that you can find any amount of terrible versions of collars, such as Mary was talking about, but not the beautiful, nothing beautiful and old, but lots of these. And when I asked them, I did take some photographs against blue pretend satin of these things, but they were so terrible, I couldn't bear to show them to you. And I said, where were these made? And she said, oh, they were all handmade. And I said, who by? And she said, well, I'll have to ask. And then she couldn't find anybody who knew. But anyway, there they are. They're still being churned out, and you can still get them along with, the standard trophies on the left. And I went into Carroll's, and the closest thing I could find to the Tara brooch is this, which is handcrafted Celtic art from the Wicklow Mountains. And I have not discovered anybody in the Wicklow Mountains, where I also live, making these. But you can buy different versions for 1995, and it is a sort of brooch with a pretend pin that doesn't work. And I thought now I would just do a postscript before we finish. Aidan Dunn, who is, I think, the most able art critic in Ireland, wrote an article called The Way We Live Now, Art in Contemporary Ireland, in a tremendous book produced by the Fenton Gallery in Cork. And he prefaced his essay, which is extremely interesting, with this painting by Nevin Lahart called Pat the Rebel, Emulator, vents his displeasure in a souvenir shop, painted in 2004. And I thought this was rather good. I think, the Emulator, I think this must be something to do with Blues Brothers. I'm not quite sure. I haven't quite got the reference, although if anybody'd like to enlighten me. But here we have St. Patrick, bashing away at the cash register, having ripped all the souvenirs off and getting extremely cross about all this pretend reproduction that prevails. What is so interesting is that, again, going back to what Anna said, is that in 1961, the Kilkenny Design report, the report by the Scandinavian report, was interested. They said, can you all see that? Do I have to read it out? Shall I just say, we found very few examples, I just focus on metalwork, we found very few examples of worthwhile design in metal. In cutlery, kitchenware, tools and appliances, the designs seem to be all derivative without understanding of the materials. As with glass or clay, a real appreciation of the material and its possibilities is necessary for the designer in metal. The absence of the small workshops and individual craftsmen is possibly responsible for the low standard. In the National Museum, we saw excellent examples, but what did we see since? Well, what they did like was, and you mentioned these, they particularly like the Harnan stands, the oat cake toasters, the griddle cake stands, which you can see in the in Tulloch Park, the National Museum, and are they still in Kildare? They're still in Collins Barracks. And they're absolutely. They were threatened to be moved, weren't they, at one time? Anyway, there they are, and superb design, and they liked those quite understandably. They liked gates, they liked certain things, and they liked these very much. What they didn't find was this by Alexander Calder. And they would have loved this had they found it in Ireland, but they didn't. So I just put that in as a sort of cautionary non-tale. What is interesting is that they did love what they saw in the National Museum, and I didn't realise that the word taut meant twisted, but anyway, there it does. And here is one of these beautiful pieces which we've already seen. And here is Brian Clark doing a necklace using that twisting technique and showing how very difficult it is. But I also put this in because I thought that one thing that does need to happen in craft, and I think this is very, very important in craft work, is that, and there are very few people who do it, and actually Mary's just gone up, but Mary knows exactly who this is because he teaches at the same school that she does. This is Clifford Rainey in the California School of Arts and Crafts. Well, I know it's lost its what's apparently called the C word. It's now called the California School of Art, isn't it? But it was the California School of Arts and Crafts until quite recently. And I think this is one of the most powerful pieces to reflect the troubles in the north of Ireland, which led Clifford Rainey to go over to London, live in, he taught at the Royal College for a long time, and he's now in California. But it's made by glass, it's cast glass. And these glass shards going across this figure, it's simply called Sebastian, and it's in the Victoria and Albert Museum. Oh, Mary, I've just been mentioning Clifford, and this wonderful piece. But I think it's really important to be topical and not always decorative and, you know, sort of fantasy. I think it's terribly important, and I do think this is an iconic piece of enormous strength. I think there are other people who are doing very interesting things in craftsmanship, not necessarily within the field of the so-called crafts. I mean, you know, in a broader field. This is Janet Malani. This piece is on the cover of the Fenton book, and it shows this figure with a greened face and greening hands, obviously symbolically, removing a mask, which it can wear, and it doesn't have to wear. So again, it's a sort of metaphorical piece which refers to Ireland, but also can refer to all sorts of other emotional states. The Breda boat, we've seen Breda's shown that the Breda, part of the Breda hoard from the 1st century BC, discovered during ploughing. And I think it's interesting to see how Janet Malani, the same artist I've just shown you, uses the boat as a symbol of transition of the mind and the soul and the body and the spirit. She uses it very beautifully, often suspended in Fenton and an exhibition she had there. She used it suspended in a tiny corner of an arch so you couldn't see it. She's used it in the Wicklow Hills near the Devil's Glen, hidden in a tree, and you have to look really hard for it. But the idea of transition, of crossing from one place to another, is as old as the hills. And she uses it particularly beautifully, but she has the sheer simplicity of that beautiful, exquisite little golden creature, which is the Breda boat in the National Gallery. Again, I mean, a reliquary like St. Lactin's alms shrine of the 12th century. I nearly finished. And I know that, is emulated in Rachel Boydell's piece, which is called He Gave His Wife a Pair of Beautiful Silver Hands, which is made out of bronze, fur, copper and silver. And again, you can draw your own conclusions. We haven't got time to here. But it is really a new reliquary. And in Cecily Brennan, who has an exhibition on at the Taylor Gallery at the moment, these are called suicide bands. One of them says, don't do it, and the other says, not today anyway. And they have, you know, slashing across where your wrist would be, or it almost looks like barbed wire. And the way that she finds forms for pain is extremely powerful. This is her piece called Bandaged Heart. So again, the reliquary, the idea of the reliquary is very important. This is a piece by a student here who graduated in 2008 in ceramics and glass, Fifi Cudmore. And again, it looks to the Germans, you know, because very often you have a precious thing deep in the heart of some sort of covering, like a diamond behind rubber, or something precious behind a carapace that you can't see. It says, sometimes I put the ring you gave me on my ring finger and pretend you married me instead of her. Very beautiful and poignant. And this sort of emotional side, I think it's wonderful to see that finding some form of expression. Donna Coogan, who's a glassmaker in Cork, an artist, made this piece here, which is just a block of silver and what looks like hair, but is actually silver wire, oxidized, for a child of hers who died when he was a baby. And there's just to finish up with Alice Marr, who's always looked at Norman and medieval Irish art. This is a stone rubbing that she did from the 13th century abbey. And just to finish off, gold balls discovered in County Roscommon, these bulle, very similar to, of course, what my two predecessors have been talking about, which she made into a piece which she calls Gorget. Which is little heads, rather like the heads which are carved and cast out of glass in a Tara brooch. But these are little heads showing various states of emotion and physical being, but they're coated in liquid chrome because she wanted them never ever to fade. And they haven't got the pieces of string through them, just as the bulle, which she found in the museum, which she always used to love looking at as a child. Because they're there, they relate to the gorget form of a circle, but without the interlocking thread, which she uses symbolically. Dorothy Cross has used metal in all sorts of interesting ways, and she uses craftsmen. I mean, she did a wonderful piece with Killian Sherman called Freud's Cut, with an enormous crystal phallus on an operating table, which was actually covered in cow's skin with others. And this looks horribly like a human breast, but actually when you see it's extremely hairy, and you realise it's part of a cow's udder with this sort of serving dish on top. Again, a lot of interesting implications there. Mary Foley digging up objects in the fields and then turning them with porcelain into fascinating symbolic objects of transition through life. Cormac Boydell using the old Celtic head with what he calls a sky bowl to reflect the sky above it. And here a piece which seems to have literally metamorphosized out of the earth. He's using ceramic with metallic oxides. And the last slide is a piece called Cahill, or the Celtic Tiger, and it's made by John Kindness. And it's a Celtic tiger against a Yule lace cloth. So he's using the Celtic tiger image. He's using Yule lace. Yule lace was a sort of lace that was revived at the beginning of the 20th century, but throughout the 19th century. Well, not throughout the 19th century, during the 19th and 20th century. So he's got the lettering of Coca-Cola and then Coca-Cola pretendedly written in Irish on a used car bonnet, such as we see littering the countryside all over the place. I really wanted to finish with that, but I just wanted to say one thing as an epilogue, which might spark some sort of discussion at this time, although I know we've got to go. In 1926, the architect and critic Manning Robertson wrote, "There is a lack of cooperation in Ireland, not only between architects and craftsmen, but among craftsmen and artists. It is only when architects and craftsmen present a united front that good work can force its sway against the stream of mediocrity that carries its way no less in Ireland than in England. The example set in Sweden, where each artist plays his part in an organised whole, might well be taken to heart in Ireland." And Glenn Adamson, in an interview with an admirer after his theorising Craft was written, asked him, "Tell me, Glenn, is there any current hotspot for craft?" To which Glenn answered, "I have been very impressed," and I know Glenn's not here so I can quote him, "I have been very impressed with what's happening in Scandinavia. You have lots of government funding, a young scene where the curators and artists often went to school together, and great opportunities for exchange. It's a place to watch." Thank you.